Hey everybody, Billy Obenauer here, continuing our lecture series on Knowing Colleagues Fundamentals of Human Resource Management. In this lesson, we'll be covering Chapter 16, Managing Human Resources Globally, and this is going to be our final lesson in this series. All right, so let's get this started. Now, one of the challenges with gaining engagement in this particular lesson revolves around the question that you see on the screen here. Do you plan on managing in another country? And often I'll ask this question when I teach this lesson in in-person class. And there might be a handful of students who plan on working outside of their home country, but for the most part, the answer to this question is no. So why then does this unit matter? And that's what we're going to cover here on the next slide. The marketplace is a global environment. Organizations are expanding by exporting products to other countries, building facilities around the world, and entering into alliances with international firms. There are also a variety of structures designed to facilitate global trade. For example, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was later updated as the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, helps to facilitate free trade among North American countries. The World Trade Organization helps to resolve international trade disputes. What does all this have to do with HR? Well, it increases the likelihood that you're going to have responsibility for employees who are based overseas, employees who travel internationally, or employees who have relocated to your country. Because of this, even if you don't plan on relocating, global HR will probably be relevant to the work that you do. As we discussed in Chapter 2, the outsourcing of work and offshoring of jobs impacts human resource management because it changes where work is being done. Now remember, there is a difference between outsourcing and offshoring. Outsourcing of work is when your organization hires another company to provide a product or service, and they may move those jobs overseas. Offshoring is when your organization continues to provide a product or service, but moves production to another country where production costs and labor costs are less expensive. As we move through this lesson, here are a few terms you'll need to know. A parent country is the country where an organization's home offices are located. A host country is a country outside of the parent country where the company operates. For example, if a company based out of the United States opened a factory in Mexico, the U.S. would be the parent country and Mexico would be the host country. A third country is another involved country that is neither the parent nor the host. In the previous example, if the company brought in workers from Belize and Honduras to work in the Mexican factory, Belize and Honduras would be the third countries. Expatriates are employees assigned to work in another country. If the American company sent a manager to Mexico to oversee the factory's operations, that manager would be an expatriate. As organizations grow, they often expand their boundaries. What starts with exporting becomes expansion into other countries. As an employer begins opening facilities outside of its home country, it becomes an international organization. As the number of facilities grows, the organization is able to minimize costs and transitions to becoming a multinational company. Eventually, the organization expands to the point that it is integrated around the world and has multiple global corporate headquarters. At this point, it's a global organization. In a global organization, it's important to have a transnational human resource management system where decisions are made from a global perspective. For this to work, managers from many countries should be included so that a variety of cultural perspectives are considered in the decision-making process. Transnational systems need to balance uniformity and flexibility. But what do we mean by that? I look to McDonald's for an example. When you think of McDonald's in the United States, you think about menus that are all the same. You get the same amount of onions on each burger. You get the same number of ketchup squirts. A McDonald's burger in New York is the same as Florida. But if you go to India, the menu is completely different. And if you go to Japan, the menu is also completely different there. That's because the demands in those countries are different from the United States. And McDonald's has had to find a way to balance uniformity with flexibility globally in terms of its product offerings. We need to do the same thing with our human resource management systems. The need for flexibility is derived from differences in cultures. Differences in cultures may influence our employees' needs. For example, the need for different days off can vary by country. Culture can influence how factors such as incentive pay motivate employees. Human resource managers need to consider their human resource management systems within the context of the culture in which they're operating. Additionally, HR managers need to carefully consider the implications of imposing their own values on employees in other countries. For example, if you limit the number of hours an employee can work based upon values in your own country, you should consider how that decision will impact that employee's ability to provide for themselves and their family. Examples of how we might look at culture come from Hofstade's dimensions. Individualism versus collectivism deals with how individuals prioritize their own interests versus identifying with the group. Power distance refers to how people deal with uneven power distribution within society or within their organizations. Uncertainty avoidance refers to one's comfort or discomfort with ambiguity and the unpredictable future. Masculinity versus femininity is often referred to as competitive versus collaborative. Originally, this dimension dealt with how strongly a culture ascribed to typical gender norms, whereas in more recent years it's been used to describe whether a culture values traits that have been traditionally associated with masculinity or traits that have been traditionally associated with femininity. I'm not personally a fan of this denotation, as I believe that it risks reinforcing stereotypes, but it is the language that is used in this widely recognized framework, so I must acknowledge it here. Long-term versus short-term orientation deals with focus on the present versus focus on the future. And indulgence versus restraint refers to seeking pleasure versus refraining from pleasure in order to conform to social norms. As you can see from the chart below, these can vary considerably by country. We need to be careful, however, not to use this knowledge to stereotype employees. It's helpful to understand potential differences among employees, but this knowledge should not be used to generalize people. With culture in mind, it's important to have the right people in the right positions. When recruiting managers for positions that will involve managing employees from multiple countries, you may want to consider managers' knowledge of other cultures. Experience studying abroad, working overseas, or speaking another language can all be signals of this. But even when managers don't have much knowledge of other cultures, there can still be an opportunity to train them. We should also select expatriates who will be able to adapt to new environments, but we should be careful not to discriminate in these assessments. It can be helpful to let employees know what will be required in terms of cultural adjustment and let them determine if they can meet the needs of the position. One factor that's impacting international markets is the growing need for knowledge workers. As we discussed during our recruitment and selection unit, when you can't find the talent that you need to expand your search, and in many cases that means recruiting internationally. Similarly, sometimes lower wages and high skill levels in other countries make offshoring an attractive option. Economic systems also influence global expansion. Labor tends to be more expensive in highly developed countries, making them less appealing targets for expansion. Income taxes also vary by country, making compensation of expatriates complex. Employees may be reluctant to relocate to a country with higher taxes. A host country's political and legal system can have an important impact on human resource management. Throughout this course, you've learned about how laws such as the Civil Rights Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act, and the Workers' Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act have influenced hiring, firing, compensation, and layoffs. It's important to remember that these laws are not global, so standards associated with these aspects of human resource management will vary by country. In addition to knowing the law, it's helpful to understand how to navigate the law in a practical sense. Host country nationals, or employees from the host country, can be helpful with this process. They often have insight into how a law is applied in a practical sense. Whether or not a company is currently doing business internationally, the global economy should be considered in HR planning. This includes understanding local market pay rates and labor laws, along with identifying ideal locations for offshoring. This is important because incorporating the global market into HR planning helps the organization understand where competitors may be gaining an advantage. HR planning should also incorporate identifying employees with the potential to succeed in international assignments. Here we have a list of traits that are associated with success as an expatriate. First, the employee should be strong in their content area. International assignments are complex enough that learning a new content area should not be part of the assignment. The employee should be a strong communicator who is flexible and sensitive to cultural differences. Along those lines, they should be willing to learn about the culture where they will be living. This may go without saying, but they should be motivated to succeed. Finally, family support is associated with expatriate success. As mentioned previously, you have to be careful not to discriminate against protected classes when evaluating these criteria. For example, rather than asking if someone has family support, you can let them know that family support has been associated with expatriate success and let them determine if the assignment is the right fit. Expats tend to go through 4 stages of adjustment. During the honeymoon phase of the assignment, everything seems wonderful, and they can't imagine why they didn't take a foreign assignment sooner. The culture shock stage is a little more difficult and refers to a time period of difficult adjustment where the employee feels a lot of discomfort. During recovery, things start to get better as the employee starts to understand their environment and build a support network. Finally, the employee reaches a stage where they have successfully adjusted to their new environment. Once assigned to a position, it's important for managers to understand that how they manage may differ in a global assignment. Although principles of performance management may be the same, the logistics may vary. A lot of the performance measurement tools that we discussed in earlier units were behaviorally focused, but culture can influence behaviors, so measurements may need to be different. If the organization is changing rapidly, performance may need to be assessed more often. Additionally, you must consider how to deliver feedback. In some cultures, direct feedback is appreciated more than in other cultures. Decisions about compensation in a global workforce can also be complex. In addition to the tax issues that we've already discussed, compensation structure can vary by nation. As you can see from this chart, the difference in pay between management and non-management employees can vary considerably by nation. HR managers need to make important decisions about compensation. Should compensation amount reflect that of the employee's home country or their host country? Which country's norms should dictate the compensation structure? HR managers need to remember that the decisions that they make about compensation in a global marketplace are going to impact their company's costs and ability to be competitive in that market. It's also important to remember that when you're looking at some of the compensation statistics that we've been looking at, these don't occur in a vacuum. Okay, you have to consider differences in education, skills, and productivity in different markets as you're determining compensation. And then finally, you need to remember that all the decisions might not be yours to make. Cultural and legal differences are going to impact these structures as well. Along those lines, different types of incentive pay, such as bonuses and stock options, are often awarded differently from one country to another. Similarly, benefits can also vary. While some countries rely on retirement programs such as 401ks, others rely on determined benefit pension programs. Also, while some countries like the United States have privatized healthcare, healthcare is nationalized in many countries. Employees in different countries also value paid time off differently. Building off the paid time off observation, you can see in this chart that the average number of hours that an employee works varies considerably by country. According to this chart, employees in Mexico work almost twice as many hours per year as workers in Germany do. Companies that operate internationally will also interact with unions in different countries. The laws governing union organization, strikes, and other union activity will vary by country. Additionally, cultural expectations regarding negotiations will be different. In some countries, negotiations may be more collaborative than in others. Whether the organization negotiates with local or national unions will also vary. In selecting expatriate managers, it's important to recognize that a successful manager will not only be competent in their area, but they'll also be adaptable. Specifically, they'll be able to maintain a positive affect through the transition and assignment, they'll be able to build relationships in their host country, and they'll recognize and interpret signals in their environment accurately. Even if you select the right manager for an overseas position, it's still important that you're preparing your expatriates properly. All right, we can do this by providing them with training on how they're going to do their job from a cultural perspective in their new location. We also need to make sure that our expats have information about practical matters so that they can live their life accordingly. They may need help learning a new language or help with career development and coaching. And sometimes challenges are going to occur that we can't plan for, but we need to make sure that we have resources in place to help them. When you think about preparing expats for practical matters, moving their belongings from one country to another is the most basic of these matters. Here you can see a quote for shipping belongings from New York to Germany, just to give you an example of what that cost, and it's almost $2,000 just to ship one pallet of belongings from one country to another. It's also important that our expats have clear goals for their overseas assignments. Okay, we need to make sure that they're getting frequent feedback on how they're doing and advice and guidance as to how they can improve their performance. Okay, there should be specific measurable performance criteria available so that they can monitor their own performance as well. Now, we've talked a lot about some of the different challenges in determining compensation for expatriates. Most often, we tend to see organizations use a balance sheet approach where the goal is to ensure that our employees can maintain the same standard of living that they've had prior to their expatriate assignment, but also give them some sort of extra pay as an inconvenience for relocation. Okay, and compensation tends to be divided into four different components of the package. You have their base salary, which is what we're going to pay them. We have a tax equalization allowance, which is an amount that is determined based upon the tax in the host country. So as you remember, we talked earlier in the lesson about different countries having different tax rates, and the tax equalization allowance essentially makes sure that our employees are not being punished for the tax rate in the country that we send them to. We have their benefits, and then we have other allowances for different costs, such as increased cost of living and other factors that we need to consider. Finally, we need to recognize that at some point our expatriates are coming home, and we need to make sure that we have a plan for repatriation or the process of preparing them to return home from a foreign assignment. And there are two different activities that we're going to engage in that are going to help make this process a little more smooth. The first one being communication. So we need to make sure that we give our expatriates information on what has changed while they've been gone. Give them the information that they need to be current when they return to their home country. We also need to engage in validation, which is where we recognize what they have done by going overseas, and we recognize the work that they've contributed and the value that they've created for our organization. Well, that's it for this lesson, and we've reached the end of the road for this lecture series. This is Billy Obenauer saying thank you so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something, and we'll talk to you soon.